Tyler Tashman with the Des Moines Register here alongside Dargan Southard. Chad Leistico is at his daughter's cross country meet. That's why he is not in attendance. I have very little doubt that his daughter is faster than both of us. But so Dargan, well, first, how's your? I feel like we haven't talked about your arm or elbow, or can we get a little status update on how you're
Yeah,
doing?
so I can stretch it about that far, so it's probably, I don't know, 90% back to its normal position, but the problem is my wrist is still very sore and very weak. So still can't throw a football, still can't throw a baseball. Couldn't do that really that well anyway when I was healthy. But yeah, we're getting through it. We're pushing through it, and yeah, should be another dose of fun on Saturday inside Kinnick.
Yeah. Was it elbow? What was the
Yeah, so it's called a terrible triad injury. Basically,
that
I
doesn't sound good.
fractured my elbow, broke my arm in two places, and you have like nerves and tendons that go all the way up here. So that's why it's still bothering my wrist, is because stuff down in your elbow can kind of foul up your whole arm. So I've learned a lot about the arm and the elbow and whatnot. I can't really recite all of it because there's a lot of medical stuff that is too smart for me. But yeah, it's been a fun journey. I have a new respect for physical therapy. It's been
That
a been a
we'll
good.
we'll have to do a separate podcast of our injury histories. And
Yeah.
no, that makes me think of I don't know if people have seen Rookie of the Year, the movie that where he breaks his arm and then comes back and is flame throwing for the Cubs. So I
Yeah.
guess that's not going to happen for you.
Unfortunately, not.
Oh, okay.
Didn't work out that way. So
Well, anyway, speaking of injuries, so Iowa plays.
I like that setup you did there.
Yeah, yeah, I had that all planned out for like 5 seconds before I did it. But uh, big game at Kinnick for Iowa coming up on Saturday, hosting Indiana, and some injury updates Kirk Ferentz gave. So one bad news, one good news. The bad news is Jazz Patterson, who got hurt in the Rutgers game. It was his first start of the season. He will be out against Indiana. The good news is Seth Anderson has been practicing. He also got dinged up in the Rutgers game, and it sounds like he will be expected to be available against the Hoosiers. But losing Jazz Patterson, well, first off, the running back position has just been getting crushed by injuries this season. And Jazz Patterson, I think, probably has been Iowa's second best running back outside of Kamari Moulton when he's been healthy. But what, Dargan, what are your, I don't know, where does Iowa go, do you think, or your opinion in where they should go in the running back room, and how big of a loss do you feel like that is for Iowa's running game?
Yeah, except for maybe linemen, just because of the collision there, play after play. I feel like the running back position is the one where the health is most fragile. And so, I mean, but what I was dealt with through these first four games is even ridiculous for that. Just basically a new running back getting hurt every week. And so I would imagine that there's, good and bad things to that, and that, everybody who is in that room and is a part of the ground production feels like that they're a part of things, and they have, a solid role, and it can be their game, any one of the ones on the schedule if they're in there. So I think that's good. You keep everybody engaged. Running backs, always want the most carries and whatnot. So I think that part has been good, is that I was had some pieces to counter some of these injuries, but it does feel like the whole room is still kind of waiting to fully get its footing under them and fully get a rhythm going. Obviously, expecting anything close to last year is probably unrealistic, but you do want just some kind of rhythm of stability and guys healthy. And so, I think Kamari Moulton had a decent showing against Rutgers, kind of getting his feet back under him this year. And I think I was going to need to lean on him even more than last week. And I think last week kind of set the table for this game in a lot of different ways. And I feel like the ground production is one of those areas, because, I was still going to need to run the ball there. Mark Gronowski's looking more competent by the week, but, Iowa still needs a strong run game and needs that to be a big part of its offense, especially with how well the offensive line is playing. And so, Jazz is kind of that. He's not necessarily the guy you see is going to break a 40 or 50-yard run, but running back success a lot of the times is 4 yards, 5 yards, 6 yards, 4 yards, 5 yards, and I feel like Jazz Patterson is pretty good at falling forward and keeping momentum going and avoiding catastrophic plays. So that's certainly a reliable weapon that Iowa's put in a lot of big situations, and so to not have him is significant. But I think Kamari Moulton was going to have to probably carry this ground unit at some point in the season. It just seems to be pretty much starting right now as Iowa goes into a game that we all expect it is going to need some points to stay in it.
It's a good thing Kamari Moulton's back because if he wasn't back against Rutgers, then you're looking at Iowa's top options at running back being Terrell Washington Jr. and Nathan McNeil. So it could have been in a much worse, shape than it is now. So I think the Kamari Moulton return came at a good time for Iowa. So Kirk Ferentz said at the press conference on Tuesday, Iowa's top three options right now are running back Kamari Moulton, Terrell Washington Jr., and Nathan McNeil. How those carries are split up, I'm not sure, but in my opinion, Kamari Moulton's the clear number one. If healthy, he's Iowa's best running back. He started the season as Iowa's starter, and then obviously that kind of went sideways pretty quickly. Now he's back. But to me, Nathan McNeil is the second best guy right now, just in terms of playmaking and talent. Terrell Washington Jr., I think is best fit at this point for like kind of a gadget role. You bring him in motion type stuff like that. I think he's just at the point in his development where he's not quite ready for that bigger role in the backfield, at least to produce. I feel like I've been a little bit underwhelmed by, his performance so far this season. Now, the dilemma with Nathan McNeil is he's someone that we've heard about leading up to the season. He's played mostly garbage time this season, and he's played well in that, but he hasn't played a lot in higher stakes situations. He finally got his first carry, on a bigger, with the stakes a little bit higher against Rutgers, which was good to see Iowa show the trust in being able to get him the ball. But I want to see, is that going to increase? Like, is Iowa, because he is probably, in my opinion, your second best playmaker in the backfield at this point that's healthy, is Iowa going to let him loose more? It'll be interesting to see. I think it's worth a shot. I think you go to him until he does something that kind of proves that, looks like something a true freshman would do, and maybe you have to sit him down a little bit. But those are the top two guys for me. And then you want to keep, you can't really, an injury to Kamari Moulton at this point would be pretty devastating. So you want to try to keep the guys that are available as healthy as possible. But offensively, so Mark Gronowski, we've seen him make strides every week. It was a low bar against Albany, but he's gotten better each week, and best performance of the season against Rutgers. Dargan, is it realistic to think, can he get better against Indiana? Or is this progression that we've seen, is it going to kind of come to an end here against the best opponent that Iowa's played all season? What do you see?
Yeah, I think there's definitely confidence that, his ascension is going to continue. I think what was an interesting part about the Rutgers game that I think was significant is because the tone in that game was set so early that Iowa was going to need points to stay in the game and was going to need offensive consistency to stay in the game. I feel like that helped everybody kind of stop overthinking things and, hey, what set of plays do we want to run here, or do we want to play it safe here? It kind of was just let it loose. And again, a lot of guys talked today about how big of a confidence boost it was that the offense essentially had to go out and win the game, and certainly keep Iowa in the game early. And so I think there's that confidence is going up. And I think based on what we saw last week with Indiana, that was obviously an extreme performance, but it's easy to see another game unfolding on Saturday where that same tone is set early, that Iowa is going to need offensive consistency, extended drives, and all that kind of stuff. And so, I think Iowa will be, Mark Gronowski is going to have every chance to match, those kind of expectations for this game. And I think, the way he played against Rutgers is really how Iowa fans have been hoping their quarterback can play for the last, 3 or 4 years in particular. In that, maybe the passing yard stats isn't off the charts, but a lot of third down conversions, a lot of red zone conversions, a lot of goal to go conversions that didn't turn into any sort of drama. I think that's a big part of what Gronowski can bring. And I think, it does feel like the confidence for this entire unit is growing and getting better, to the point where, Rutgers probably isn't going to be the last game that Iowa's going to need its offense to kind of spearhead the attack. So, I think yesterday or Friday was kind of a good appetizer for, the kind of gameplay that we could see on Saturday. And I think it really sets the table for this Iowa offense to take an even bigger step forward against a better team in, what's going to be a high stakes environment, even at home. I think all the cards are there for Iowa to, continue this rise offensively, and be in a position where it can win games a lot of different ways. Because we saw last week, the Iowa defense has shouldered so much pressure the last 4 or 5 years as being, having to feel like that's the way Iowa's going to win and going to be the reason that Iowa can win. And so to alleviate some of that stress and pressure, for this particular defensive unit, I think is a good thing because, as we saw last week, this defense is still, coming together and needs some time before, it's clicking at a level of expectation that Iowa fans have come to demand, honestly, from their defense.
And it just felt like, I think against Rutgers, Iowa's offense, it was like a sense of urgency. And whether that was, there actually was a different sense of urgency, it just looked like that. Like Iowa knew that they needed to kind of turn it into another gear. And they actually, for the first, it's not been common for them to actually be able to do that. And they were able to make that happen. And in the other, so is Mark Gronowski going to be able to make that step? To me, it hinges on Iowa's offensive line. They've been really good this season, but I mean, we haven't talked much about Indiana, and they just throttled Illinois in what was kind of set up to be a bigger game, and it was not even close. And Indiana's defense just wrecked Illinois' offensive line. Indiana had 7 sacks. Illinois finished the game with 2 rushing yards. So like Indiana's defense and defensive line just totally controlled the game. Luke Altmaier was just disrupted. So to me, for Mark Gronowski to even have a chance to be better than he has the first 4 weeks, that requires Iowa's offensive line to contain Indiana's defense in a way that Illinois wasn't able to. And Iowa's offensive line has been really good through the first 4 games of the season, but this is going to be the best defense that they've faced so far. It's a really good defense. They've only played one real opponent. The other ones have been much lower level, but Indiana has been pretty dominant. So to give Mark Gronowski a chance, I think the O-line is going to have to validate the way that they've played the first 4 games of the season. And then you hope that, you give Mark Gronowski some time in the pocket. You give him the opportunity to run, you open up the running game, and then things can kind of maybe come together in a way that they didn't even get close to doing against Illinois. So to me, the offensive line is going to be a major key in this game, and being able to kind of keep Indiana's defense, at bay a little bit. But Indiana, so they enter the game, 4-0, 1-0 in the Big Ten. They're firmly in the college football playoff conversation. So bigger picture, this is a huge matchup for Iowa. Do you have any thoughts, Dargan, on Indiana or Kurt Signetti or anything of that nature?
Yeah, it does feel like on a lot of fronts, the Indiana game is kind of the culmination of the early part of the season. We have a lot of units defensively, offensively, the O-line, quarterback, all the key parts. Like you said, this is going to be everybody's toughest test so far across the board. And, there has been progress week to week. And so, this kind of feels like the big first exam of the semester in a way. And so, I think Iowa's offensive line is probably playing with as much confidence as any position on the team right now, just because they've been dominant and they've really, led the way in a lot of ways. And so it'll be interesting to see how those guys play. But also, one of the things that really stood out from the Rutgers game was how much Tim Lester was able to get Mark Gronowski, whether it was bootlegs or rollouts, kind of get him some more space to operate. And obviously his legs in spots have been really good. Obviously, down by the end zone has been a huge weapon for Iowa to have. And so, I think that can alleviate some of the things across the board if Gronowski has more time, more space to operate. But yeah, I mean, Indiana comes in here. I mean, you couldn't really draw up a better performance in what was, a big environment and a big game and something that, Indiana is not really used to being in the spotlight for. And so I think them handling that game that way, even though it was at home, Iowa or Illinois has an elite quarterback or one of the best quarterbacks in the Big Ten, and Indiana made him look largely irrelevant. And so that's obviously a team that's coming in here with a ton of confidence, a ton of belief. And, last year it was kind of, Kurt Signetti's never hidden his opinion about anything. And last year kind of felt more like breaking through and getting on the scene and figuring out how to, be an upper tier Big Ten team. Now it feels like Indiana has shed that, transition a little bit, and now is just knows it's a good team, knows it can beat anybody in the conference, knows it can walk into what's always a tough environment on the road, Kinnick Stadium, a place Indiana hasn't won since 2007. So again, I think there's a little bit of probably some overreaction by how well Indiana played, putting up 63, a dominant effort across the board. So I don't think this feels while a tough game, it feels like one that Iowa, can wrap its hands around and really feel like it has a chance, maybe compared to some of the other big ranked opponents that they've played in recent seasons. So, I think the stage is set there for Iowa to, deliver a big performance and counter what Indiana's done with a big upset. But obviously, it's going to take a pretty seamless effort coming in here pretty much across the board.
Yeah, the flip side of kind of what Iowa did on offense against Rutgers is that the defense struggled early on. Rutgers, really made Iowa look bad in the past game, and Indiana has one of the best quarterbacks in the country, Fernando Mendoza. They have good receivers, Elijah Surratt, and Omar Cooper Jr. It's going to be a difficult task again to try to slow down a passing attack. I mean, it didn't inspire the Rutgers defensive performance didn't inspire a ton of confidence, even though they had played really well. Like the first 3 games of the season, they did a good job containing Rocco Beck. I mean, that the defense, it was a valiant effort in Ames, and Iowa, wasn't able to win that game, but uh, it raised some red flags, I guess, the Rutgers game, and now they're taking on a really big test in Indiana's offense. Kirk Ferentz, had talked about, you know, basically that Rutgers early on in the game, he felt like they were pretty much flawless in the passing game. So I think it was partially on how good Rutgers was and partially on the way Iowa was playing early in that game. And then Jalen Watson getting a little bit of run too. It seems like he's firmly in the mix at cornerback alongside TJ Hall and Deshaun Lee. He came in late for Deshaun Lee in that Rutgers game. So, I mean, Dargan, how concerned are you, or that Rutgers game, the way that Iowa's defense played? Like, I mean, was that an aberration, you think, or is there something there to be kind of concerned about moving forward with Iowa's defense?
I think there's an appropriate level of concern to put into play here. I think behind TJ Hall, a lot of those guys are going to continue to have short leashes or shorter leashes, because it only takes a couple of miscues on the corner side of things to have a big play go against you, and then momentum is sucked out of the game for you. So I think that um, that's a big part of it, and it'll be interesting because maybe after the Michigan State game last year was the only time recently where the defense has kind of been under pressure to perform better immediately after a letdown performance. And so that's not something that Iowa's defense has really had to deal with. Needing to be better immediately, in a very specific area. And so I imagine that those defensive guys, particularly in the secondary, they know what the standard is here. They know what's expected. I'm sure they're the first to tell you that Friday's performance was not good enough, and really exposed some areas. So it's a chance for Iowa's defense. If the secondary is solid on Saturday, obviously that's going to be a huge confidence lift to that unit, and could really get those guys back on track. But the flip side of that is there's potential for another disaster. So I think you can find a little comfort in that Iowa's defense got better as the Rutgers game went along. But you looked at how some of those bigger Rutgers receivers just really did whatever they wanted, particularly early on. And there's definitely level of concern there because, the secondary, I feel like, yeah, you have your veterans there, but if it's, particularly at the corner spot, even TJ Hall up top, who's played really well, this is his first time being the guy and the leader of the cornerbacks. So, even he has had to, feel out this early part of the season. So again, I would say of all the units that have the most pressure on them going into Saturday, I mean, you could put Gronowski in the offense at one, but I feel like it's really the secondary because it doesn't take long for secondary breakdowns to burn you on the scoreboard. And if Iowa has too many of those, then you can envision the offense not being able to keep up and the game kind of getting away from them. So limiting big plays is always key for Iowa's defense, but it feels even more important and even more essential given what we saw on Friday.
I think a key to doing that against Indiana is like making Fernando Mendoza uncomfortable because you kind of saw with Ethan Kaliak-Manis, like early in the game, he was in a rhythm getting the ball out. Like it felt like he was real comfortable in the pocket. And then
Yep.
later in the game, like Iowa got some pressure home. They started getting hits on him. And then you see things start to not come together as smoothly. I think Iowa has to find a way to make Fernando Mendoza uncomfortable in the pocket. He can move a little bit. He's not like a dual threat guy. So, if you can get a Max Llewellyn and Ethan Hurkett coming off the edge, we saw Brian Allen get in on the action in the Rutgers game. That to me is a way to disrupt Indiana's passing game. And on top of that, like, getting your defensive line, getting their hand up, tipping balls, stuff like that. I think that is a really good way for Iowa to be able to help out its secondary, right? Like to try to disrupt Indiana's passing game. And they're rushing for over 300 yards as well. So it's like, if you take away the passing game, there's no guarantee that the running game isn't going to do damage either. So, they're a pretty complete team, not to mention that they blocked a punt and returned it for a touchdown against Illinois. So special teams is also a way that they can, do damage. Bigger picture, I'd say, going back to just the game as a whole, I feel like Indiana has more to lose. Like
Yeah.
Indiana, they're kind of nationally, like they're expected to be in the college football playoff hunt. They still play Oregon and Penn State. So like if they were for some reason to drop this, then there's a little bit more pressure on them to go and beat Oregon and Penn State, or else they could be at risk of missing out on the college football playoff. Whereas Iowa, at this point, the college football playoff hopes are very, very slim. They would need to run the table. This would be a pretty good start at trying to change that, but it's at Kinnick. You're going to have the crowd at your back. I feel like there's a lot more for Indiana to lose in this matchup than there is for Iowa. So, any parting thoughts, Dargan? Or
Yeah, I do agree with that because, while last year was all about ruffling feathers and finding respect, I do feel like Kurt Signetti has gotten Indiana quickly at a point where there is that level of respect and that this isn't just going to be, a program that pops up and has one good year and then disappears. So, I think I agree that Indiana's playoff hopes are a little more legit than Iowa's at this point, but it feels like, you know, given what both of these teams have down the road, if you drop this one, it's hard to envision some of those other games going uh, the way that both of these teams want to. So, a lot at stake on Saturday for sure.
yeah, and it's the expectations for Indiana. Like
Yeah,
they're expected to go in and win this game,
absolutely. Yeah,
despite the fact that it's a tough road environment. This is their first road game all season, so that's the dichotomy of the Indiana program, which has just been a bottom feeder basically in the college football ecosystem, and now dealing with being expected to be, a dominant force. So appreciate everyone for tuning in. Chad Lystico and I will have our normal podcast and radio show on Wednesday. So appreciate everyone, and we'll talk to you soon.